Today I'm going to speak with Professor William Happer on his views regarding man-made climate change. Professor Happer is a leading expert in atomic physics, spectroscopy, and optics. His pioneering research has led to numerous advances in these fields, for which he has earned several prestigious awards. He received his PhD from Princeton University in 1964. He then began his career in academia at Columbia University. After more than a decade at Columbia, he returned to Princeton, this time as a faculty member, where he worked as a research physicist and university lecturer for more than 3 decades before retiring in 2014. Professor Happer has served as a science advisor to the U.S. government during 3 presidential administrations. He has published more than 200 scientific journal articles. He has been the chair of the Princeton University Research Board from 1995 to 2005, and he's also a co-founder and board member of the CO2 Coalition, which aims to educate the world about the benefits of CO2 while dispelling myths that it's a harmful gas. CO2 Coalition is a great resource, and I highly recommend everyone check it out. Professor Happer, welcome. It's a great honor to speak with you, and I want to thank you for meeting with me today.
Well, thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to chat with you.
I've got great admiration for those who've devoted their lives to science. I have a science background, as you know, but I didn't go the science route. I wasn't drawn to it, didn't feel it was my calling. And, in science, it's very competitive. You got to love it, and you got to be super good, or, I don't think there's a chance you're going to be a university professor. It's very, very competitive. I don't know if people outside of that field really understand just how competitive it is.
Yeah, it's a hard way to make a living, Mike.
Yeah, well, it's a passion. You do what you love. I also hold those who speak the truth, no matter how unpopular or inconvenient to be, amongst the biggest heroes of humanity. So I want to thank you, Professor Happer, for the sacrifices you've made in your courageous fight to preserve scientific debate pertaining to your stance on man-made climate change. I'm sure it hasn't been a wonderful trip, given that you're not in the so-called consensus, so they say.
Well, I'm definitely not in the consensus, but that's okay. Consensuses are often wrong, and that's the case today also.
These days, I think that's particularly true with the internet and all the misinformation. So before we begin, I want to ask you about your childhood. You weren't born in the U.S., were you?
No, I was actually born in India under the British Raj in South India in what's now Tamil Nadu. And I remember it fondly. India's close to my heart.
That kind of struck me as interesting. India's an amazing place. I haven't had the chance to go there yet. And of course, they're one of the great developing economies. Let me ask you, what led you to the field of physics? Anything in particular?
Well, I think partly because when World War II broke out, I was born just before the war, and my father was a Scottish medical officer in the Indian Army. My mother was American, and when the war broke out, Japanese were advancing very rapidly through Southeast Asia and were already threatening India, and my father was going to be deployed, to the front. He thought we would be safer. We could go back to America. America was not in the war then at the time. So we were sent on a British ship around South Africa to try to avoid the German submarines who were sinking every British ship they could catch. And we did safely make it back to America. Not all the ships that left Bombay did, but we did. And my mother needed a job, and so her job turned out to be working in Oak Ridge in the Manhattan Project. So as a toddler, really, preschooler, I remember all of the excitement in the Manhattan Project and all of the engineers and scientists. And I thought, this looks like an interesting way to make a living. If I'm good enough, maybe I'll try and do it myself. So I think that was probably why I went into it, although both my parents were doctors. So the scientists also, a good doctor is a good scientist.
Wow, that's an amazing story. Fascinating. I had no idea. It's one thing I'd seen interviews and I'd never heard about your background, but I understood that you grew up in India.
Yeah. Well, we went back to India as soon as the war was over. I was glad to get back to India. I missed the food.
So let me ask you, what led you to become a vocal critic on global warming and man-made climate change?
Well, I think the tipping point for me was I spent several years in Washington in the early 90s under George Bush Sr. and for a few months under Clinton and Gore as director of energy research at Department of Energy. So I was responsible for all of the non-weapons basic research. So I had a big budget. It was $3.5 billion. It was more than the NSF. And I wanted to make sure I understood what we were supporting, what the taxpayers' money was being used for. So I would have people come in once a week and give me a scientific seminar on what they were working on. We would have people come in from Fermilab and tell me what was happening in the search for the top quark, or someone would come in from a drilling project looking at deep, drilling and life, bacteria living at 10,000 feet underground. The world's an amazing place. Or people would come in and tell me about progress in plasma physics. And we were also supporting work on climate and environment. And when we would ask these people to come in, they would often be very reluctant to even come. I remember one said that, my lab, we work for Senator Gore. And I said, well, that's fine. And, but, we're paying you. And if you don't want to come and tell us what you're doing like everyone else from every other field, I'll just use your money next year for some other field. I don't have to fund you every year. And that would usually get them to come. They were often, very hostile as a result of being ordered around like this. I didn't think it was ordering around. Most of these other groups were absolutely delighted to come to Washington because some bureaucrat was interested in what they were doing, and it was a chance for them to show off what they were doing. And the people from climate didn't want to come because it was almost as though they had something to hide. So that's was the impression it made on me. So after I was out of Washington, as soon as Gore and Clinton came in, they couldn't wait to fire me, but it took them a while to find me in the organization chart and get me out of there. And but I was glad to leave. I never thought of myself as a bureaucrat, and my work was still going on at Princeton, and they were kind enough to rehire me. So I was busy for the next 10 years approximately working on my own work. But I would see these crazy news reports from the, gullible media about one climate lie after another. And I would be upset in the evening. And my wife finally said, why don't you speak up? There's nothing I can do if you get outraged at the newscaster. Find some way to get other people to hear it as well. And so I owe my wife, Barbara, the instigation for finally speaking up, and I've continued it ever since.
That's very interesting, actually, thinking about you as a hardcore scientist thrown into this bureaucratic position, and I guess not understanding perhaps what a bureaucrat's supposed to do. It's agree with the administration, I suppose, right? But that's good that you kept your scientific core. Let me ask you a few questions here so people can understand your position. Is it accurate to say that you believe man-made climate change is not a threat to life on Earth?
Yes, of course, it's not a threat. I mean, there is some man-made climate change, which you can see with your own eyes if you live in a city. If moving to New York, it's several degrees warmer any day in New York City than it is 30 miles away up in Westchester and in more rural areas. And so there's a very pronounced heat island effect in heavily populated areas because you build buildings that affect the circulation of the winds in the air, which cause cooling, and you plow under fields and build buildings, and so you don't get transpirational cooling from the green growth that used to be there. So it's quite well understood that built-up areas are warmer than the surrounding unbuilt-up areas. So that's human-caused global warming, but maybe global isn't the right word. Maybe you should say human-caused local warming. I also think there is a little bit of human-caused global warming because I know more about radiation transfer than most climate scientists. And, CO2 really is a greenhouse gas and it causes a little bit of warming. But they've exaggerated the amount that it can warm by huge factors, hundreds of percent, factors of 4 or 5, something like that.
That's something you bring up, by the way. Sorry to interrupt you. I wanted to bring this up. I was going to talk about this. I know how the scientific community is typically, and fortunately I'm not in it because of my view, and maybe I have a different view because I'm not directly in it. As such, I have maybe some strong views about science that I think most scientists aren't going to really say, just because they have a lot of colleagues in different disciplines and so forth, and they don't want to step on anyone's toes. But, you mentioned that you have a pretty good expertise in things that really directly pertain to global warming. I was going to bring this up because a lot of people don't understand. You're a world expert in spectroscopy, optics, and anyone that knows anything truly about global warming knows it's a lot about spectroscopy. You're talking about, if you're an expert in spectroscopy, you're the person I want to talk to about global warming. And I think a lot of people don't know enough about science to appreciate that. People will criticize you and others. They'll say, well, you're not a climate scientist. Great. I don't want to hear from a climate scientist. Number one, they're on the payroll. They've got a narrative, right? They're not true scientists as far as I'm concerned. Their mission, their objective is to prove an outcome. That's not science. That's a political agenda and maybe a monetary agenda. Number two, in my opinion, I believe there's two sciences. I tell people all the time, there's two sciences in the world. There's physics and chemistry. Everything else is basket weaving as far as I'm concerned. Because every other discipline of science is applied science. It's applied from the laws delineated from chemists and physicists. And it's the chemists and physicists that have come up with the core scientific principles. Therefore, if I want to know about something in science related, I want to hear from a chemist. I want to hear from a physicist because they're the true scientists in my opinion. So that's kind of what I wanted to express to people because it's so frustrating to hear, well, you're not a climate scientist. When I was growing up, when I was in school, I'd never heard of climate science. I never heard of a climate science department. Now, you could speak on this better than me, but to me, it seems like that whole discipline was kind of made up, maybe kind of merged through geology and essentially created by the government. Think about it. If you have a chemistry department, physics department, clearly there's a need for chemists and physicists beyond academia. But what's a climate scientist going to do? Who's going to employ climate scientists? In the future, they'll have them in corporate America, I'm sure, but you can see what I'm getting at. So no one ever brings this up. I think it's something certainly to think about because it goes to the agenda.
Well, Mike, at the risk of being too flippant, I sometimes say you don't you don't have to have a PhD in astrology to question how useful horoscopes are.
Right.
And so everything you said about climate science is true. It's very heavily dependent on government funding, and you can't make an honest career very easily if you're a good scientist. There are some good climate scientists, and parts of that program actually have been very beneficial. For example, the instrumentation on satellites and on the ground that has been put up has been very useful. And so I was always very supportive of that when I was at the Department of Energy. In fact, I made sure some of that happened. The ARM program in the Department of Energy is something that I helped to get started. It was under my organization that we started that. Ari Petrinos was my right-hand man there. And so some good things have happened. And when people were pursuing the philosopher's stone and turning lead into gold, they actually laid some of the foundations of chemistry. So even seemingly crazy efforts by humans, if they're done thoughtfully, produce some good results. And so climate has done that too. But at the time we're talking, it is still heavily hampered by political constraints, and I hope soon that they they will be freer to do real science. I think the field has been set back by probably 50 years because of this mad focus on carbon dioxide instead of what are the many things that affect climate. There isn't a single control knob for climate. There are lots of control knobs, and carbon dioxide is one of the less effective ones. But you've been forced by governments to pretend that the only thing that controls climate is carbon dioxide levels in the air. It's absurd.
And of course, I was looking at your Wikipedia entry. Don't get me started with Wikipedia. What a complete disaster that has become. And of course, not surprising, they mentioned the phrase, Happer, who is not a climate scientist, rejects the scientific consensus on climate change. Of course, so that is kind of a psychological dig at you, right? So you're not a climate scientist, therefore you're not legitimate, especially considering the consensus doesn't agree with you, right? Which is, that's they can't lay out a good argument. They want to go ahead and defame you and put you in a poor light. And it's kind of interesting because I was looking through your Wikipedia and I was looking through your accomplishments, and I'm saying, wait a second, he's got to be in the National Academy of Sciences. I know enough about science to know when I read a bio whether someone is probably in the National Academy of Sciences. And I didn't see that in your Wikipedia entry, coincidentally, because they don't want to position you as an authority that you are. For those who don't know, the National Academy of Sciences is the most exclusive club of science and science-related disciplines in the world. They only induct maybe, 100 people from around the world in all disciplines every year. There's maybe 2,000 to 3,000 members. It's the ultimate dream of every scientist to become a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and I think that just about every Nobel Prize winner has come from that group. So, of course, they don't want to name you as a member because that's going to be, for anyone who knows about that, that's already. I mean, if I have someone in front of me who's not being funded by climate research, and they are a member of the National Academy of Sciences, I'm going to listen very closely to what they have to say. And of course, the difference is, I guess the key point is, if they're being funded by something related to climate change, I want to listen to someone who doesn't have a bias. Isn't that what scientists are supposed to be all about, right? Isn't that what science is about?
Yeah. Well, you're right, Mike. And Wikipedia was captured long ago by climate activists. It's really too bad because it has distorted a number of their articles, not just attacks on people like myself, but also some branches of science. Any branch of science that has anything to do with climate, if you read about it in Wikipedia, you should take it with a grain of salt. If you look at an article in pure mathematics on Wikipedia, it's outstanding usually. So they've done a wonderful job in many areas, but they've let themselves be hijacked by the climate fanatics. So it's something they really should be ashamed of. They should correct it, but they don't seem to be able to bring themselves to do that. And, you talk about, who's funding them. They used to talk about, scientists paid by the oil industry or, of course, I've never taken a dime from the oil industry. I'm not funded by anyone. I'm retired and I'm living off hard-earned savings for retirement. But they're funded by highly interested parties. The government uses climate alarmism as a means to consolidate power and to get more power. That's the age-old way of getting power is you declare an emergency, you have a war, you have internal enemies, God knows what, but that's always works. And now they're using climate as that tool. People should wake up and recognize what's going on.
If someone comes to me and says, you know what, the pollution, the emissions from the diesel fuel, the combustion, something needs to be done. I think who's not going to agree with that? It's definitely a problem with that. But when you come out and talk about all life on Earth is in imminent danger because of global warming, because of man-made climate change, then, obviously that's done to create a fear, an alarmist effect, so that, I guess, Al Gore can increase the assets under management of his investment fund, which he started, of course, as I'm sure you know, before he went on his little climate change spree. So, you don't hear about that. I think, they talked about it a long time ago, but that's something that should not cease to be talked about. Al Gore him and his comrades are managing $38 billion of so-called green investments, which I would say probably most of which aren't even green, by the way. I don't know how Google is green. So let me just ask you about this. According to man-made climate change narrative, the release of carbon dioxide leads to an increase in the Earth's atmospheric temperature. Does the data support this? Is there evidence that carbon dioxide is related to temperature? And if there is, can you kind of qualify that relationship? Because I've seen it, I think, reported perhaps a little simplistically.
Well, as I've said before, I do think carbon dioxide causes a small amount of warming. It's something I know a lot about, and it's hard to avoid the conclusion that you'll get some warming if you double CO2. So the real question is, if you were to double CO2, how much warming would you get? And it's a peculiar property of CO2 that every doubling produces the same warming. So one doubling from, say, 400 roughly today to 800, and after you've doubled, if that gives a degree of warming, or if it gives 3 degrees of warming, to get another 1 degree or another 3 degrees, you have to double 800 to go to 1600. So that's called a logarithmic response. So every doubling of the amount causes the same amount of warming. And it's hard to argue against that, for detailed technical reasons on how CO2 molecules absorb and emit. The problem is that nobody knows how much that doubling warming will be. The favorite number by the establishment, the alarm establishment, is somewhere between about 2 degrees and 5 degrees centigrade. And, if you do basic radiation transfer physics and calculate how much warming you would get, you find that it's of the order of 1 degree or maybe a little bit less, so much smaller than the establishment number. And so it's easy to understand the difference. The difference is the establishment assumes that most of the warming from CO2 is from feedback, positive feedback. So if 1 degree is what you get without feedback, and they agree with this. You can't avoid this. It's from basic physics, F equals ma, right? So that's not enough to please your political masters. So you have to get more warming than that, and so we introduce positive feedbacks. And so most of the alarming warming reports that you hear of are due to very big positive feedbacks. They're much larger than normal feedbacks in nature. In fact, most feedbacks in nature are negative. They're not positive. So if it were a normal natural system, if CO2 caused, say, a degree of warming, degree centigrade, then the natural feedbacks would mean that it would produce actually a little bit less than that, maybe quite a bit less than that. So not only is the size of the feedback very surprising, but also the sign of it. It's unprecedented to have that large a positive feedback in a natural system. And you can't measure it. That people don't understand that there's no way observationally that you can measure the effect of doubling CO2. And the reason for that is climate is always fluctuating. It is warming. It's pretty clear that it's been warming for roughly 2 centuries. There was major warming in the 1800s, and it couldn't have been from CO2. So the point here is that nature itself causes the Earth to warm and cool over every time scale. It warms and cools every 24 hours between day and night. And it warms and cools every year between summer and winter. And there are much longer periods of warming and cooling. And we have just come over a sort of a several century scale warming and cooling in the Little Ice Age. In the Little Ice Age in 1600s, 1700s, it was very cold. And it began to warm up around 1800, and it is continuing to warm up. And so nobody knows how much of that warming is due to carbon dioxide and how much is the continued recovery from the Little Ice Age. And this has happened many, many times in the past 10,000 years, the Holocene, they call it, since the last glacial maximum. And it clearly had nothing to do in the previous episodes. So how can you tell how much CO2 is affecting it today? It can't be very much, because what we're seeing today hardly differs from what we saw in the year 900 to 1000 when the Norse settled Greenland and started farming the southern and southwestern tips of Greenland.
Speaking of that, of course, one of the most common examples of evidence for climate change is the claim that certain ice caps are melting. And so, of course, that's part of the whole drama. They're showing the ice caps melting. Now, I have my own ideas about this, but I want to hear what you have to say. What's your response to that?
Well, ice caps are a pretty good thermometer, but what determines how big a glacier is not so much the temperature as a combination of the temperature and the rate of precipitation in the headwaters or the head snowfall areas of the ice field. And so, for example, if you look at the glaciers on Kilimanjaro, they're practically on the equator, but they're glaciers on top because it's so high. And we've got very good records of the temperature on Kilimanjaro. Temperature has hardly changed. But the glaciers are shrinking somewhat. They're still there. Al Gore said they were begun, but they're still there. But the reason they're shrinking is there's less snowfall on top of Kilimanjaro. And that has to be, most people think that's due to changes in land use. There's a lot of forest that's been cleared around Kilimanjaro for farming. So there's less transpiration and less snowfall. So all of these pieces of evidence have confounding factors that you have to look at very, very carefully. And there's so many for the warming that we're experiencing today that you just can't tell how much is natural and how much is not. But there's no question glaciers are melting. They've melted many times back in the past too. If you look back in the medieval times, they melted then. And then this was the year 1000, 1200. A lot of the glaciers in the Alps shrank and glaciers in Norway shrank. And if you look back to the Holocene climate optimum, say 5,000 BC or something like that, most of the glaciers were not there in Norway or in many other parts of the world too. So advancing and retreating of glaciers is completely normal. The Iceman they discovered in Austria, Ötzi or whatever his name is, this poor guy was covered with snow, and when the weather suddenly turned colder and has been under the snow now for 2,000 years or 4,000 years, I guess it's Neolithic or something like that. But that tells you that when he was trapped, it was warmer, and he was caught just as the climate was getting colder and colder. So, yeah, of course, glaciers are melting, but you have no idea what's the cause. It's almost certainly mostly due to poorly understood natural causes and not due to increasing amounts of CO2.
So it seems like this is kind of part of they cherry pick. They find what fits the narrative, and they don't really look exactly what's going on. If it's convenient for the narrative, then they highlight that. It's what it seems like to me. Can you give me some other examples of how the climate change advocates cherry pick data to form kind of maybe a false or loosely held conclusion?
Well, yeah, you're correct. It's best described as a narrative, and people, it's in our genes, I guess, to make narratives, to explain things. There were creation stories, in every civilization about how the world came to be, and some were more believable than others. And so we make up narratives to try to understand the world around us. And if we're honest, we recognize some of the narratives actually are not quantitatively correct. And so the difference between ordinary human activities and real science is science also makes narratives. You basically guess new insights, new theories. But then at that point, if you're a real scientist, you try to knock down your guess. Okay, if this is true, how could I prove it's false? And so what climate science, so-called science, has not done is it's not made any effort. In fact, it's done just the opposite to avoid subjecting this field to the criticism that science is supposed to get. In the Catholic Church, if you want to be a saint in the Catholic Church, you have to have a devil's advocate to examine the case. Maybe this person doesn't deserve to be a saint. And so this is even in a religion, there's this idea that there needs to be, the other side needs to be heard, audiatur et altera pars. But that never happens with climate. It gets a free ride. So it really needs a good scrub by knowledgeable people who can criticize it and who are not crazies. And there are a lot of them out there, and it should be done. It would be a much better effort and begin to get some scientific respect, which has very little now.
It seems like the climate science is not really, they're not really applying the scientific method to their studies.
No, that's right. I mean, it's not terribly sophisticated if you don't criticize yourself and get others to criticize too, because you can often not see your own faults. You need, another set of eyes to look at what you're doing.
Yeah.
Then you quickly just go completely off the rails, and that's what's happened to this climate movement.
Yeah. So, you mentioned earlier, and of course, I told the audience that you served in 3 administrations, and you mentioned you didn't stay too long in the Clinton administration, and you also didn't stay too long, surprisingly, in the Trump administration. Would you care to give us the inside story on your early departure?
Yeah, well, under Trump, they asked me to come down to the National Security Council and help them with technology. And, I've done some important things for defense technology in the past, so I guess that was the reason they invited me. And I said, well, I'm too old to go and do that now. But I tell you what, I'll make a deal if you'll let me try and get a review of climate science while I'm in the White House and get the president to sponsor it. Then I'll come down and help with all these other technical matters. And they thought about it for a few weeks, and they finally said, okay, come on, you can do your best to persuade the president. We're not going to hinder you. We won't help you. But I thought that was good enough. And I said, okay, I'll come. I'll get a year's lease and corporate housing. And, you know, when the lease runs out, if something's happening on climate, I'll renew it and I'll stay with you. Otherwise, I'm going back home. So I went, and they indeed let me try to make my case to the president, which I eventually did. And Mr. Trump was interested. He thought it was a good idea. But his political advisors were, dead set against it, most of them. And they thought it was going to cost him votes that he would need in the next election, the, re-election campaign, which he lost anyway, or is said to have lost. I don't know whether it was true or not. Um, and so after the year was up, it was pretty clear that his political advisors had more weight than I did. And so I said, well, look, thanks. I've enjoyed it here. I've done my best, but I'm going back home to Princeton. I've got other work to do. And so that's why it was a year. It was planned to be a year. I only agreed to go for a year and to begin with.
Can you tell the audience about the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, and discuss its role in the climate change narrative?
Yeah, well, IPCC is an organization of the United Nations, I think. I have to study the org chart carefully, but I believe that's correct. They were formed back in the early 90s, about the same time I was director of energy research. Environmentalism was a fashionable thing back then. Still, it's more than fashionable today. It's the source of lots of, very harmful policy decisions. But then it was just simply fashionable. You could boast about your environmentalism at a cocktail party. It didn't matter much. It didn't cost you anything. And so they formed the IPCC, and it was a way to push the environmental agenda, especially in connection with climate. They needed some threat. We discussed earlier how important it is to have threats if you're grasping for power. And they had started back in the 70s with the threat of global cooling. Of course, it was due to mankind for various reasons. And indeed, it was cooling. It started cooling in the 40s, and it got colder and colder until about 1976 or 77. And then it suddenly changed sign. It wasn't predicted. The Earth just did it. And so it was pretty clear that the global cooling meme wasn't going to work. And they switched to global warming, whatever works. You need an emergency. And so by 1990, they had gathered their forces and they set up this UN body, and every government would send representatives to be part of this organization. They had a director, they had a staff, they spend a lot of money, they write enormous reports. Actually, if you look at the scientific writing in the IPCC, it's pretty good. It's a little bit biased, not very much, but no one reads that. It's thousands of pages you have to wade through, so you can't do that. So each section gets summarized, so there are fewer pages, and then the summaries get summarized again, and there are fewer. And as you go up this pyramid of summaries, the summaries get more and more alarming. They're not alarming at the bottom, where all the real data is, and they get more and more alarming as you reach the final press release that the chief of state makes. It's the end of the most recent IPCC meeting. So, it's a waste of money in my view. I think it's long-lived. It's long past its usefulness. It should be abolished. Yeah.
Well, I think it's, as you mentioned, it's a part of the United Nations, so I think it's a way for them to spread their narrative around the world, right? They've got the guys in each country that it's kind of like, the IMF. When the IMF has an agenda, they want certain social reengineering. Well, if they want to try that in Japan or South Korea, well, they've got Japanese and South Koreans working in the IMF. The officials are going to trust them because they're part of that's kind of how they work. It's what I've noticed. They kind of have an inside man that they indoctrinate, through several, so I think that's kind of the situation. And we see it around the world. Now a lot of these developing countries that asking for loans, you'll notice they'll always add climate change, right? Because they know how to get the money. If whatever they need money for, they've got to add the climate change. And so let's talk a little bit about potential corporate agendas, money, and politics. We've talked a little bit about that, but I'm going to give you some questions that I've always thought about myself that just don't make sense. Why did the establishment change from global warming to man-made climate change? Of course, Al Gore told us, he's the one that told us it's global warming and, all these predictions. He talked to the scientists, and then we changed a few years later to man-made climate change. I guess that goes back to what you were saying, whatever fits, whatever we need, right?
Well, Mike, of course, I don't know, but I think part of the problem was that early on they had talked themselves, I'm talking about the alarmists, they had talked themselves into the idea that there was going to be this obvious warming. Everyone would notice every summer was warmer than the previous one. And, the gardens were dying, the lawns were dying, because of this ever-growing heat. And it was pretty clear, after a few years that almost nothing was changing in the climate, in terms of heat, things that you could feel yourself. So by making it climate change, it was possible to persuade you that maybe you didn't notice it, but actually the Great Barrier Reef is dying, the polar bears are dying. You can't go there and check it yourself. This is a point that my friend Patrick Moore likes to make, a founder of Greenpeace, that if you look at the examples are things that you just can't check. You have to take someone else's word for them. You could check the warming. I know perfectly well what the temperature is outside. I went out this morning. It was 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Very, very nice. A week ago it was 80. So everyone can feel the temperature, the warming, and it's really not changing very much. So you need something that's easier to alarm people with.
It's difficult to argue. How can you say the climate's not changing? Of course it's changing. But this way, it gives them leeway, leverage to say, well, we don't know if it's warming or getting cooler. We just know that man is causing this dangerous situation and we have to stop it. Why has there never been a global prohibition of the common practice of engineered obsolescence? Obviously, that's a wasteful use of energy, right? If they're designing things to break down, that means there's going to be more consumption, more expenditure of energy. It's inefficient for our economy. I mean, that's an easy thing to tackle. Third question is, why has there never been a ban on wasteful uses of energy, such as lighting of skyscrapers at nighttime? I mean, all over the place. What's going on? Isn't this one of the easiest things to tackle if all life on Earth is in imminent danger because of climate change, the wasteful use of energy? Number 4, why isn't consumer frugality promoted versus excessive consumerism? You've got the corporate America getting people to buy more, instead of being more frugal, right? This excessive consumerism. And number 5, does it make sense for taxpayers to subsidize EVs and the EV industry when all electric batteries obtain their power from combustion of fossil fuels and thus create CO2 emissions? How does this provide a solution to the climate change problem? Billions and billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars going to green and the EV industry, which I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but the last time I checked, I didn't see any solar panels fueling these EV cars. Right? I mean, how is this helping? So when you think about all these questions, it's pretty suspicious. I don't see how electric vehicles is. In fact, you could argue it's actually much worse for the environment because of the mining of the rare earths and the disposal problems with the lithium batteries. I guess my point is that it seems to me that the whole man-made climate change narrative and it's really about money.
Of course,
it's about money.
Money and power. If it were only about money, that would be okay with me. You know, but power is worse.
If they really wanted to address man-made climate change, these things that I'm talking about, they could affect a lot of change, and they wouldn't be wasting money on the EV industry. So it seems to me that everything with the climate crisis, it centers upon increasing taxes, providing tax breaks to high-income earners and subsidies to corporations, increasing control over people's lives, and giving more power to politicians and technocrats. That's what it really seems to me to be all about.
Yeah, of course, that's exactly what it is, and it's sometimes described as a massive transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich, and we keep the third world, the undeveloped world, barefoot and pregnant, and we get richer and richer ourselves. Talk about justice.
I guess one more question. I wanted to ask you, is there a relationship between ozone depletion and global warming?
Well, some people think there is. I don't see how there could be very much because the ozone depletion you're talking about is in the stratosphere, which is, 30, 40,000 kilometers overhead. And it's very hard for that to have much influence on the surface. One of the signatures of CO2 is that we expect the stratosphere to get a little bit cooler, and stratosphere hasn't been cooling that much. So there are all sorts of half-baked speculations about why that's the case, and the amount of ozone is an important issue there too. So if ozone is depleting, that gets mixed in a complicated way to what CO2 is doing. It's an interesting question, but there's very little sign of very much ozone depleting over most of the Earth. When you read about ozone depletion, they're usually talking about the polar regions, the Antarctica or to a lesser extent the Arctic, where every spring there's this massive ozone hole that forms. And when it was first observed, people thought that was mostly due to human emissions of chlorine-containing compounds, refrigerants, mostly freons. I think right now people are wondering more and more, how could that be? Because we banned them now 20, 30 years ago nearly, and the ozone hole's still there. It's bigger. It was bigger than ever. It was very big this past year. It was certainly not small. And so it probably has always been there, and it fluctuates. It grows, and some years it's smaller, and other years for very complicated reasons. So I would say ozone probably is not very important with warming. Everything has a little effect on everything else. So of course, it will have some small effect.
Of course, that was a big topic of debate a few decades ago, right?
Right. Yeah.
That was the alarmist situation back then. I guess that did.
Yeah, that was one of the bones of contention between me and Gore. Gore didn't like me insisting that, we get a few more facts about ozone before we do expensive policy decisions. And
you can't underestimate a man who created the internet, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And also, he brought us the wonderful world of NAFTA, which has been it's been a great help to the working and middle class America, right?
Well, I'm grateful to Gore,
Yeah. So, I mean, Al Gore, I used to think Bill Clinton was the biggest con man in politics, but I think Al Gore's got him beat. And I think we can see that today with what he's done.
Well, you have to admire him for his effectiveness. When people can actually do something, whether it's good or bad, there's a certain amount of talent involved.
Yeah, well, nothing for me to envy, but I can agree with you there. He does have a talent. But well, Professor, we're going to end it here. I think you shed a great deal of insight into the man-made climate change picture, and hopefully people will approach this critical topic with an open mind so they can decide for themselves what's really going on instead of blindly accepting what's being forced onto them. Professor, thank you again for your time and everything you've done for science, and I hope we can speak again.
Thanks, Mike. Good luck to you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.